We are compelled, then, to ask at this juncture whether or not the Mexican lotus was as relevant to sun gods in the central highlands of Mexico as it was for the sun gods of the lowland terrain of the Maya. For we have already recognized various symbolic devices that these distant cultures once shared with one another, and those devices included images of lotus emblems, feathered serpent motifs, aquatic skulls, water lily trees, and such. Now, botanical determinations of abstract and symbolic renderings of any particular plant that appears on temple facades or fig bark paper paintings of the Aztecs are often fraught with doubts and disagreements. However, in the case of water lilies, we have some distinguishing characteristics that separate this plant group from all others in Mexico. One of those features relates to the plant's aquatic affinities, since water lilies spend their entire lives pushing up flowers and blades from underneath the water. Another distinctive trait is the plant's large and bright yellow ovarian disc in the center of the flower that fills itself with sparkling nectar secretions during the first day of a 3-day flowering period. The blossom's abundant nectar tends to enhance the reflection of the light from the sun, and in this way simply dazzles the eye with the flower's golden refulgence. No other flowering plant family in the world shares this unique feature, this feature of water lilies, and these distinctions are key to recognizing the plant's commanding role in central Mexican plant symbolism. The National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City has a permanent display case filled with a collection of quote-unquote flower stones from the Valley of Mexico and environs. Most of these stones were gathered from a marshy region on the southern flanks or fringes of the Valley of Mexico during the Age of the Conquest. Not so far from what we call today the floating gardens of Xochimilco. This village's title meaning field of flowers, Xochimilco. But Xochimilco is not exactly a field, but rather a system of man-made floating islands surrounded by expansive lakes and wetlands. This artificial system of floating croplands, referred to by the Aztecs as chinampas, were once managed to sustain a highly productive agricultural zone in an otherwise natural wetland. The canals that linked the islets of Xochimilco must have been filled with water lilies during this age, as one might expect, since all the remnant stones from Xochimilco are polypetalous flowers with what we call a tetramerous arrangement of flower features. This is to say, in botanical terms, that the sepals and first whorl of petals in the flower are 4 in number and occupy the 4 poles of a radial flower. This being a trait that is not very common among wetland plants. These same stones also portray a flower with a large and centralized disc-shaped pistil in the center. This, too, is another telltale feature of a water lily. A highly original and detailed depiction of these flowers is observed on an early classic polychrome ceramic from Teotihuacan, north of Mexico City today. Dating from around the 4th century AD, the floral structures on this plate confirm a water lily determination without a shadow of doubt. For the face of the bowl is surrounded by an array of long linear petals, within which is confined a wheel-like discoid structure that is surrounded by a circular water motif, as if the blossom was overbrimming with liquid. And within the watery interior of this flower, we we observe a large discoid flower pistil that looks like a wagon wheel with spokes and a nippled hub. This feature highlights the form of a water lily with exacting precision. The pistil is comprised of a ring of flat and fused seed chambers, and the central hub is nippled. Water lily pistils of such type always fill to the brim with a liquid exudate on day 1 of flowering, as observed here in a lilac pigmented variety of Nymphaea elegans of central Mexico. The welling nectar magnifies the brilliance of the golden disc by reflecting the light of the sun. Incoming bees that intend to collect the flower's pollen often fall into this water trap, which serves to wash pollen grains off the visitors to effect pollination for the flower. That each leg of this Teotihuacan tripod bowl is comprised individually of 3 feet, and that each foot is decorated with a floral rosette, is likely intended to reflect the 3-day lifespan of a water lily flower. Yet another diagnostic feature of the blossom that figures prominently in both Aztec and Maya floral symbolism. And in fact, we know that water lilies were a popular motif at Teotihuacan, as we have emphasized in our episodes on water lily skulls and world trees of Mesoamerica. More often than not, these symbolic flowers are arranged in groups of 3, and often as a blossom that is sandwiched between 2 lotus buds. This clay water lily stamp from Teotihuacan, with 2 water lily buds flanking a blossom, typifies the manner in which water lilies tend to appear in groups of 3. This is no less common in Egypt, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East as it is in Mesoamerica. The simultaneous employment of flower and sun symbolism is perhaps best exemplified by a popular stone altar labeled as a sunstone from the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology. What I am interpreting as a bud motif in water is conventionally identified as a snail symbol by most art historians, but the symbol is normally associated with fluxions of water and a full-blown polypetalous or stylized trefoil, both being vegetative motifs and always found in a watery medium. After decades of studying these symbols, I have never seen a motif of this type that is ever associated with a tentacled slug emerging from this so-called shell. In fact, the lateral line that bisects Tenochtitlan's water lily buds with horizontal striations seems to borrow from classic water lily bud imagery many centuries earlier at Teotihuacan, where the lotus buds were typically divided in the long dimension by a similar lateral line with linear projections to one side. Still, an unambiguous sun disk and its anthropomorphized sun god in the Codex Vindobonensis Mexicanus, a well-known pre-Columbian pictorial book of the Mixtec people, actually provides a comprehensive impression of Aztec sun symbolism. The Mixtec prospered in lands just south and west of the Valley of Mexico during the late Classic period, and they shared a large repertoire of symbols and glyphs that would later become a standard issue among the Aztecs and their scribes. The Codex Vindobonensis is a ritual and genealogical document, and this particular illustration portrays the birth of the sun as a rising series of solar orbs that ascend over a summit of a pyramid. These solar orbs bear a distinct resemblance to solar images that we observed on the aforementioned wood lintel at Chichen Itza, just as they mirror the image of Aztec sun signs. Not unlike Mesoamerica's aquatic flowers, this orb is 8-membered, but with 4 alternating red and blue triangular rays. The personified sun in the upper disk is widely interpreted as the Aztec sun god Tonatiuh, even though various members of Mexico's pantheon share similar relationships. The lowermost of the dawning suns contains within it, however, a notable symbol, this being a rooted floral motif with a trefoil emerging from its coil. The single circlet that is attached by a thread indicates that we are dealing with one flower in the Aztec calendar, xiu-coatl, this being a day name for the final day of the first 20-day cycle at the inception of an initial movement of the cosmic sun. So the association of a cosmic solar flower and a celestial orb seems to imply, in universal terms, the general notion of the concept in the beginning. Now, there are no petals on this solar motif, for these sun signs focus more on a celestial orb and sun god than on a flower. Nevertheless, we do note that the sun is 8-rayed and that stalked tridents surround the sun and the flower. And those stalked tridents are standard features of most of the so-called flower stones, not sunstones. We observe some similar floral motifs on another so-called sunstone from the Aztecs' capital city of Tenochtitlan, which actually portrays 4 self-reflective impressions of a cosmic polypetalous flower on all 4 sides of a square altar. This flower apparently floats in an aqueous medium because it is surrounded on all 4 sides by a ropey water motif, just as 2 water signs, those trilobe deltoid structures with a basal curlicue, are placed strategically in the 2 upper corners of the stone. The blossom here has only 7 petals, because the 8th petal is presumably covered up by a copious overflow of watery nectar that streams from the flower's large and disc-shaped pistil. No doubt we are dealing with a water lily here. The radiant qualities of the flower are enhanced by an aura of closely packed radiating lines around the petals, a visual device that was employed quite frequently by the Toltecs at Teotihuacan many centuries, if not a millennium earlier. An alternative face of the same supposed sunstone portrays a singing bird that has perched itself on a highly stylized Aztec world tree. No suns here. Once again, the divine plant is surrounded by water and similarly produces 8-membered flowers with large discoid pistils and thick roots in water. These features mirroring the same flower we just observed up close with a copious overflow of nectar. On yet another face of this altar stone, we observe a familiar but somewhat enigmatic motif that must certainly relate to water lily symbolism as well. For this motif is surrounded by water signs, as denoted by 2 circlets, and we note as well that the same water signs well up from the middle of what might be interpreted as a stylized, floating polypetalous flower, above which a trident emerges with 2 lateral volutes, presumably the flower's reflexive sepals. The central triangular element, suspended by the crossbar in the middle of the motif, is called a trapeze and ray motif, this being a calendric glyph that denotes an annual solar cycle, or what the Aztecs referred to as the xiu-coatl, xiu meaning turquoise and poali meaning day count, the turquoise day count. The glyph is typically attached to the lotus skull god known as Tlaloc with his turquoise flowers. But here the stylized flower floats with a dazzling glow in a watery medium. At least a half millennium earlier, This same year sign was similarly suspended over a stylized water lily flower on the famous murals in the Temple of Agriculture at Teotihuacan. Note how water lily blades and buds extend across a water surface to the left and right, while a highly stylized profile of the floating flower shares the same paired basal volutes, 5 internalized jade/water signs, and golden deltoid stamens, highly stylized, obviously, the pollen-bearing structures of the flower, inside an arch of pigmented petals in the round. The dark color of the petals suggests we are observing a floating blossom of Nymphaea elegans. To follow this interpretation of the water surface's feathery motif, we recommend you consult our episode on the Mesoamerican water lily skull. The association and conflation of floral and solar motifs in the highlands of central Mexico is expressed in many and various ways. And among the many distinctive renderings of the symbol, we find that a majority of these circular motifs actually lack the rays of the sun, and conventionally replace the sun's rays with a round of petaloid or feather-like elements. And just as consistently, these same subjects are always surrounded by water sign circlets, the jade signs, the xiu-coatl. One such stone in Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology is labeled as a quote-unquote lunar flower stone. This being attributed to the unexpected appearance of a rabbit figure with a corolla, the flower's collection of petals, the rabbit being a popular symbol of the Aztec moon. However, the circle of rounded border elements have been interpreted by museum curators as petals, and I would say justifiably so, even if we recognize the same 4 triangular ray elements that typically occupy the 4 poles of a solar symbol. Here they occupy the 4 poles of a radiant flower, which has the suspicious appearance of a sun. In the center of this flower, we observe a cross-shaped glyph that reads as Olin in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and meaning movement or stirring, in reference to a day on day 1 of a world eon. So symbolically, this would be a polypetalous sunflower that moves, descends, and the circle of orblets that surround the Olin sign symbolize water, of course, which, as we now know, suggests an aquatic blossom. For what sun, or moon for that matter, overbrims with water? Now, although most art historians identify these orblets as night signs, I'm thinking they represent stalked trefoils that have produced a large drop of nectar. Now, while there is always room for skepticism when it comes to symbolic plant identifications, in this instance, we are fortunate to have a corroborating source of evidence that pretty much confirms a water lily determination for these sunflowers. And this comes in the form of a ritual text that was authored a few decades following the Spanish conquest. This written record, known as the Cantares Mexicanos, records the practice of using 2 types of drums for drinking and singing rituals that resulted in a divine sort of inebriation and feelings of ecstasy that Aztecs experienced during these religious rites of passage. We dedicate an entire podcast and video to the subject of the Cantares Mexicanos on our website. And we conclude in these discussions that the inebriating waters of life that were drunk during these ritual songs and dance came from liquids that gathered in the Atlaquitzonan flowers in these rituals, which are identified as specifically as water lily flowers. So bearing in mind that these specimens of art derive from the same time and place in Mexican history as the cantares mexicanos, the decorations on the drums are quite relevant, as they portray many features that we have already associated with Aztec sunstones and flower stones of the Mexica people. And they carve these sunstones and flower stones directly on the drums that they used to celebrate the drinking of the sunstruck dew of waterlilies. For example, we observe a radial array of petals in an aquatic medium, deltoid ray-like motifs on 4 quarters of an aquatic disc, water signs within a flower, and a prominent olean glyph in the center of the disc. A water band that surrounds the drum in the middle section of the drum, the upright drum, this being the xiu-coatl drum, portrays a bundle of arrows that are covered with a shield that bears 7 water lily signs. These would be the floral weapons of participants in the aforementioned Aztec song and dance rites. Their weapons being a Atlaquetzonan chimbali, water lily shield, and arrows. And they would use these weapons to enact dramas involving the return of war spirits and divine creatures to God's eternal shores. And this emblem seems to be a carbon copy of yet another so-called sunstone of Mexico. This association with arrows relates to the role of water lilies in divine warfare of Mexico, details of which are covered already in our episodes on the cantares mexicanos. Or if we compare and contrast the so-called lunar flower with the other xiu-coatl drum, how can we not appreciate the aquatic character of the Aztec sunflower? What we observe here is a divine eagle descending on a water surface with an insignia of divine warfare in his beak. This would be the Atl Tlachnoli motif, or water and blaze motif, which portrays a blazing or radiant trident flower emerging from a flow of water that comes out of the bird's beak. A replica of that flower is positioned just below the water line in the middle of the drum, with a lateral perspective on in fact, a floating flower. Note how the realistic array of petals transforms itself into an outer row of stylized petals, the exact likes of which we observe on essentially all floral stones of the Aztecs. This is the Aztec flower known as Atlaquetzonan, a title that means literally goddess of the waves. So this goddess would be a Mexican nymph, scientifically known as Nymphaea elegans. The blaze that issues below the water lily flower is also positioned strategically over the trefoil that emerges from a spray of water issuing from the bird's beak. This blossom being described as a quote-unquote water and blaze flower in the cantares mexicanos. Indeed, the cantares identify these blossoms as blazing flowers of the dawn, xiu-coatl, or flowers of the sun, tonala-xochitl, which arise in multitudes on the Aztec creator's eternal shorelines. Heart-pleasing flowers, the singers would chant, filled with sunstruck dew, which they would drink. We know that this flower was of utmost importance in Aztec symbolism and ritual because it takes a front and center position on a throne of the abiding king of the Aztec Empire during the Spanish conquest. So as you see here, this plant had the king's back covered. And that would be Montezuma II, some 600 years ago, the unfortunate emperor of the Mexican people that suffered a horrible defeat to the Spanish, his name being, of course, Motekuksoma Shokoyotsin, our Montezuma. The prominent sundial on the back of the throne has a direct bearing on imagery we observe on the solid arms of the throne, insofar as they highlight the habitat of the so-called solar motif by illustrating water lilies erupting from a body of water, including both radial and profile perspectives of the flowers, as is often the case, among aquatic jade circlets and rippling currents of water. And below this aquatic scene, we observe a peculiar motif that is thought to provide a calendric date for the dedication of this historical stone. The sign is comprised of 4 decurrent volutes that surround a floral palmette of sorts, with a straight blade-like element that is situated within a watery medium, as indicated by the jade signs. I am not fully convinced that this motif was used solely as a date reference, because we encounter the same symbol on so many other stones and ceramics from the valleys of Mexico and Puebla during the post-classic period. And these recurrent motifs indicate quite clearly that the symbol relates to water lilies, since a spray of profiled petals with a crooked stalk at its base is actually a symbol, an Aztec symbol of the Mexican lotus. The Maya adopt a very similar sign, without the curlicue stalk, which they refer to as the Imish glyph. To the right, we observe a 4-sepaled aquatic flower that displays a polypetalous rosette at its base and a bud-like element in its center. Note that a water sign is also positioned within the motif and above the floral form. A libation cup from Tollan Cholula today portrays these same flowers in aggregation as though they were part of a lotus grove. But one of those flowers also supports that peculiar blade-like structure, or perhaps sepal, that arises from the center of the flower. All of these water lily themes on a king's throne share a close relationship, then, with the blazing disk on the back of the throne, which bears the standard image of an Aztec sun, with many of the same features we observed on the Toltec sun at Chichen Itza some 5 centuries earlier. We observe the same 4x4 array of triangular ray elements in the round, the outer of which form part of a petaloid ring, which most commentators interpret as feathers. But, as you know, I am inclined to identify this ring of squared appendages as petals, based on the recurrent practice of using these exact same elements in floral symbolism. Jade circlets encompass the periphery of this solar motif, just as numerous circlets fill the inner disk. And jade signs positioned on the rim of the motif align themselves with stock triads of petals or sepals that emanate from the disk-like rays. The 4 circlets that surround the Olin sign in the center of the sun seem to suggest the presence of water/nectar once again, while a half-open reptilian eye in the middle of the disk connotes a shining inner disk. The Olin sign signifies movement, Olin, of water lilies, when the flower drums of the Aztec paradise call forth the mythical drinkers of the plant's inebriating sunstruck dew. We can compare and contrast this serpent's eye fixed within the Olin glyph with a similar eye that occupies a water lily meander motif on the walls of Tepantitla at Teotihuacan more than a millennium earlier. Here we see the eye occupies the center of a lotus blossom, and a lotus calyx that has lost its petals and descended into the underworld to shed its tears with jade signs and eye insignias. Shared patterns of symbolism are undeniable here, and these are not sun symbols. In returning to the Mexican sundial, on the back of the throne, we note that the god to the left of Montezuma's sun disk has a hummingbird headdress. He has a snake-like hatchet and a serpent leg. The former attributes identify this divine being as the Aztec creator spirit known as xiu-coatl, the left-handed hummingbird. But the serpent leg is more suggestive of the Aztec god Tezcatlipoca, smoking mirror, this being a bizarre characteristic that this version of the hummingbird god shares with the solar and lotus gods known as xiu-coatl in the Maya pantheon. We recall that xiu-coatl has a serpent leg as well. And that serpent leg is a water lily serpent. We can be sure that these gods shared close connections to water lily use in ritual, insofar as they employ an atlaquetzonan chimali and xiu-coatl in divine warfare. That would be, respectively, a water lily shield and a turquoise-serpent. These would be weapons of the sun god and other gods. And these attributes are not without their obvious symbolic significance. Insofar as the Aztec hummingbird spirit, Huitzilopochtli, also seconds as a sun god in Aztec tradition and shares his turquoise serpent weapon with Tonatiuh, the principal sun spirit of the Aztecs. And do take notice here how Huitzilopochtli decorates his head with a bouquet of water lily flowers. Alternatively, the figure on the opposite side of the Mexican mandala is interpreted in different ways, sometimes as the king himself. This figure wields the same serpentoid hatchet, but his axe displays a blazing floral motif. The symbolic flourishes that extend from the mouths of the attendant figures are, once again, as we know now, are fire-water signs, the Atl-Tlachinoli motif, and we actually know that a hummingbird spirit once paid witness to the water lily libation rites during this age by recalling refrains from the drinking hymns of the Cantares Mexicanos. Where might I just get some good and fragrant flowers? Who might I ask? Why, perhaps I'll ask the precious hummingbird, the jade hummingbird. Let me ask the butterfly with the color of a saguan bird. For they are the ones who know. They know just where the good and fragrant sweet flowers bloom. I will amble through this grove where the trogons live. Let me saunter through this flower grove of rose-colored swans. That's where the flowers are bending with sun-glistening dew. Unquote. And we know that the blazing flowers of the sun refer to water lilies, because these are the plants that are associated with the focal Oling glyph in the middle of the motif, which discharges tears from the floral sun. And Oling is the verb that is used in the Cantares Mexicanos to refer to the descent, twirling descent of divine flowers from the heavens of God. It is noteworthy that a similar floral motif and a number of its symbolic equivalents are often placed on the navel of an important earth goddess of the Aztecs known as Xiu-coatl. This popular deity in Aztec iconography is a crocodile, whose name means literally in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, Earth Lord, Tlal, Earth, Tecuhtli, Lord. Modern commentators normally refer to this scary creature as the Earth Monster, on account of her formidable gaping mouth, threatening crocodilian teeth. You can see these on the top of the gaping jaw, and slashing claws. But the navel of the crocodile, the earth spirit, seems to project or dangle a floral motif. As we notice that the image lacks the standard spiky ray-like elements of a Mesoamerican sun. We also observe a single stalked triad of calyx segments that seem to descend from the flower's hub, bearing another water sign as a drop of nectar from 3 calyx segments. That would be the way I see it. And note that the radial motif is also surrounded by water signs. For this is, after all, the aquatic world of crocodile, not exactly the natural source or goal of a sun. All of these symbolic features point again to water lily symbolism. Other portrayals of the goddess highlight a massive quincunx in the mandala's dazzling hub, that 4+1 symbol that emphasizes a central disk surrounded by 4 calyx segments of a water lily. The flooring codex of post-conquest Mexico acknowledges that the cosmic crocodile was a creator spirit, as either Intonan or Intota, these terms meaning in Nahuatl, our mother, or our father. This is because the divine croc's body was sacrificed in Aztec cosmology by 2 powerful celestial spirits, namely Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca. The aim of these 2 gods was to create the earth and sky by sacrificing and splitting apart the reptilian creature's body in half, one becoming the vault of the heavens, the other the earth. So this being the case, xiu-coatl is thought by modern-day scholars to swallow the sun at sunset, only to regurgitate it anew on a daily basis. But this is a speculative and plausible explanation, but not really based on written information. An alternative rendering of xiu-coatl from the capital city of the Aztecs portrays the goddess with a dazzling disk on her navel that seems to present 3 or 4 sepals of a floral motif. Note also that her feet are decorated with a stalked floral motif, a habit that was also adopted by Maya artisans, because they too recognize a crocodilian god to symbolize the earth. This is a Mesoamerican widespread motif. We can appreciate this by a large stone altar at Copan that portrays this aquatic creature as a source of water lilies, as earth producing water lilies from its ankles and its ears. At this junction, I refer our listeners to our published article on the Mesoamerican world tree in the research menu of our website, where we explore the details of a glorious crocodile and the birth of a Maya world tree. On this Maya ritual platter, a lotus tree of life arises from a watery netherworld and produces 3 stalks that terminate in water lily buds. A Maya crocodile surrounds the rim of the water world, with his head on the right side of the bowl and his skull bearing water lily symbols on its tail. Note that the inverted skull on the saurian's tail represents an underworld form of Maya god G1, Tonatiuh, and that his forehead bears the kin glyph, the sun sign. So once again, the sun and sun-like flowers converge upon a third creative principle, in this case an earth spirit that is covered with water lilies. This particular aquatic paradise is inhabited by a pretty impressive portion of the Maya pantheon, including a divine serpent, bird, crocodile, jaguar, aquatic skull, and anthropomorphized water spirit, all of whose lives revolved around the central focus of the scene, a thrice-branched water lily plant. In our next episode, we will compare and contrast all of these symbolic creatures and elements with Aztec sunstones and find that, in fact, they appear to be flower stones.